The Yorkshire estate that Eleanor Rosewood had been engaged to manage occupied a geographical position of considerable isolation, situated as it was within the moorlands that characterized that portion of northern England. The manor itself, a substantial structure of grey stone that communicated both considerable antiquity and meticulous maintenance, existed largely removed from the social circuits that typically engaged women of Eleanor's modest yet respectable circumstances. It was to this isolated residence that she had come, 4 years preceding, upon the demise of her father's clerical position in a distant parish. Her uncle, the estate's steward, had solicited her assistance in the management of the household's female dimensions, a role that Eleanor had undertaken with characteristic capability and genuine commitment. The Christmas season of 1856 was advancing with the particular intensity that characterized that time of year. The moors surrounding the estate had assumed the austere beauty of winter, their rolling contours rendered white by snow that had accumulated across the preceding weeks. The manor's interior was being prepared with the traditional observances that characterized the season. Evergreen garlands adorned the corridors, candles had been positioned throughout the principal rooms, and preparations were advancing toward the celebration of the Christmas festivities that would characterize the season's conclusion. It was on the morning of the 23rd of December that the coach arrived bearing the unexpected visitor, who would permanently alter the trajectory of Eleanor's existence. Captain James Ashford, Baron Thornfield, has been invited to remain at the manor through the Christmas season, Eleanor's uncle articulated, communicating this information with considerable gravity. His circumstances are such that he requires a period of recovery and repose. He is the ward, the distant ward, of the family that owns this estate. I rely upon your discretion and your capacity to ensure that his comfort is appropriately maintained. Eleanor perceived, through the careful manner in which her uncle articulated this information, that there existed dimensions of the situation that remained incompletely explained. Yet she possessed sufficient experience with household management to comprehend that her uncle's reticence likely derived from genuine concern regarding the captain's circumstances. The man who subsequently emerged from the coach communicated through his bearing and appearance the precise source of such concern. Captain Ashford moved with the careful deliberation of one whose physical capacity had been substantially compromised, yet whose determination to maintain the appearance of capability remained absolute. His left arm hung with visible limitation of mobility, and he required the assistance of a walking stick, an implement that he appeared to regard with considerable frustration, to navigate the distance from the coach to the manor's entrance. Eleanor observed him with the acuteness of perception that years of household management had cultivated. She perceived, beyond the evidence of physical wounding, a deeper wounding that no physician could adequately address, the wounding of a man whose sense of purpose and capability had been fundamentally compromised by circumstance beyond his control. "Welcome to Thornfield Manor, Captain Ashford," Eleanor articulated, stepping forward to greet him with the courtesy appropriate to a guest of considerable social standing. "We are delighted to provide you with such comfortable surroundings as will permit your recovery." The captain's storm-grey eyes regarded her with an intensity that seemed to penetrate the carefully maintained courtesy of her greeting. "Miss Rosewood," he replied, his voice communicating the particular quality of restrained emotion that characterized men trained in military discipline, "I must confess to considerable reluctance regarding this entire arrangement. I am not a man accustomed to the acceptance of charity or to the role of invalid that circumstance has imposed upon me." "I perceive," Eleanor replied with characteristic directness, "that you regard your presence here as constituting an imposition. Yet I suggest that the acceptance of assistance when one's circumstances necessitate such acceptance is not a form of weakness, but rather a demonstration of the wisdom to recognize the limitations imposed by circumstance and to accept the support that genuine community offers." The captain's expression shifted marginally, a subtle softening that suggested her response had generated within him something approaching surprise. "You are remarkably forthright for a woman of your station," he observed. "I am in a position," Eleanor replied, "that permits forthright communication. I am neither your superior by station nor your subordinate by occupation. I am merely a woman engaged in the management of a household that you are invited to occupy. That position grants me the liberty to communicate with authenticity rather than with the defensive courtesy that propriety frequently demands." The captain's lips curved slightly, in what might have constituted a smile. a gesture so subtle that Eleanor perceived she might have imagined it. "Then I shall endeavour to reciprocate your authenticity with my own," he replied quietly. Over the subsequent days of the captain's residence at Thornfield Manor, Eleanor discovered that beneath his guarded exterior and his evident frustration regarding his physical limitations, there existed a man of remarkable intelligence and surprising philosophical depth. She encountered him frequently in the manor's library, where he spent considerable hours engaged with texts on matters of considerable intellectual complexity. "You read with remarkable intensity," she observed one afternoon, discovering him absorbed in a philosophical treatise of considerable density. "Reading constitutes one of the few pursuits that my current physical circumstances do not render impossible," he replied, regarding her with those extraordinary storm-grey eyes. "I find that intellectual engagement renders temporarily bearable the reality of physical constraint. Yet constant escape into intellectual matters renders one increasingly remote from the lived world," Eleanor suggested. "I wonder if engagement with actual human connection might not constitute a more authentic form of restoration than the perpetual retreat into books." "Human connection," the captain replied with evident bitterness, "is a commodity that I have discovered to be remarkably scarce. Most individuals regard me with pity that I find considerably more uncomfortable than solitude. Others regard me with the wariness of one observing a man rendered fundamentally unreliable by wounding. Authentic connection, Miss Rosewood, appears to be a luxury that my circumstances no longer permit." "Then perhaps," Eleanor replied, "your circumstances are less determinative of your capacity for authentic connection than you currently perceive. I suggest that you permit me to demonstrate that not all individuals regard you with either pity or wariness, but rather with the recognition that wounding does not diminish essential character." The captain regarded her for an extended moment, his expression communicating an internal struggle between his inclination toward protective distance and his recognition that something in her offered a different possibility. "You are either remarkably naive or remarkably courageous," he said finally. "I have not yet determined which." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied with a gentle smile, "I am both." The passing of days within Thornfield Manor witnessed a gradual transformation in the relationship between Captain Ashford and Eleanor Rosewood. What had commenced as careful courtesy, Eleanor's professional engagement with a guest of considerable social standing, the captain's guarded acceptance of necessary assistance, began to evolve into something of considerably greater depth. Eleanor discovered that the captain possessed remarkable capacity for conversation regarding matters of genuine intellectual and philosophical significance. She found herself engaging with him in discussions of literature, of ethics, of the fundamental questions regarding how one should conduct oneself in the face of circumstances that generated profound limitation and apparent meaninglessness. "You approach these questions," Eleanor observed during one of their afternoon conversations, conducted in the library whilst snow accumulated upon the windows beyond, "with the intensity of one for whom these questions possess not merely abstract significance, but profound personal consequence." "You are correct," the captain replied, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the firelight with remarkable clarity. "My wounding was not merely physical, it was also, in a manner of speaking, spiritual. I spent the preceding 15 years engaged in military service, a service that I believe to be meaningful, that I believe to constitute the appropriate expression of duty and honor. And then, in a moment of circumstance beyond my control, that entire framework of meaning was rendered impossible." He paused, and Eleanor perceived that she was witnessing a moment in which his carefully maintained emotional distance was beginning to fracture. "I was wounded not through glorious combat, Miss Rosewood, but through my own moment of inattention, a moment in which I permitted my focus to diminish. A soldier under my command was killed as consequence of my failure. My own wounding was, in a manner of speaking, insufficient compensation for that failure." "You ascribe to yourself responsibility for circumstances that transcend individual control," Eleanor replied quietly. "I perceive that you have constructed a narrative in which your wounding constitutes appropriate punishment for an error that was fundamentally human rather than uniquely your own failure. You articulate this with considerable certainty for a woman who has never experienced military service or the weight of command," the captain replied, though his tone communicated no genuine hostility. Rather, it suggested a testing of her willingness to maintain authentic engagement despite his defensive challenge. "I acknowledge the limitations of my perspective," Eleanor replied. Yet I observe that you are engaging in a form of self-punishment predicated upon an impossible standard of perfection. I suggest that authenticity requires acknowledging such impossible standards for what they are, constructions that generate suffering without generating genuine redemption. The captain rose from his chair with visible effort, moving toward the window where the snow continued its accumulation upon the Yorkshire moors. "You perceive with remarkable clarity," he said finally. "I confess to being considerably unsettled by your capacity to articulate truths that I have spent months attempting to conceal from myself." "Then perhaps," Eleanor suggested, rising also to stand near him, "my presence here constitutes something more valuable than merely ensuring your physical comfort. Perhaps I am here to demonstrate that authentic connection, genuine engagement with another human being, might constitute a form of restoration more profound than solitude or perpetual self-recrimination." The captain turned to face her, and Eleanor perceived in his expression an internal struggle of considerable magnitude. "You are offering me something, Miss Rosewood, that I am not entirely certain I am capable of accepting. You are offering me the possibility of being perceived as something other than a wounded man, defined entirely by his limitations." "I am offering you," Eleanor replied with characteristic directness, "the recognition that you are a man of considerable intelligence, principle, and capacity for authentic emotion. Your wounding has altered your circumstances, yet it has not altered the essential substance of who you are." As Christmas drew closer, the nature of their engagement deepened in ways that Eleanor perceived would have generated considerable comment had they occurred in more socially scrutinized settings. She and the captain fell into the habit of spending extended periods in the library, their conversations ranging across subjects of remarkable intellectual and emotional complexity. They engaged with each other's perspectives, with the absence of performative distance that typically characterized social interaction, instead offering each other the gift of authentic engagement. One afternoon, approximately 3 days preceding Christmas, the captain requested Eleanor's assistance in accessing certain texts from the highest shelves of the library, texts that his limited mobility rendered otherwise inaccessible. As Eleanor stretched upward to retrieve a volume of considerable age and value, the captain positioned himself to provide stabilizing support. In that moment of physical proximity, Eleanor perceived a trembling in his left hand, a trembling that transcended mere physical limitation and communicated the degree to which emotional agitation accompanied physical proximity. "I must confess to you," he said quietly, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic vulnerability, "that my resistance to your kindness derives not from genuine disregard for your efforts, but rather from fear that permitting myself to perceive you as something other than a manifestation of duty and obligation might generate consequences that I am not prepared to confront." Eleanor turned to face him directly, her dark forest green eyes meeting his storm-grey gaze with complete absence of protective distance. "Then I suggest," she replied softly, "that you permit yourself to confront those consequences, whatever they might entail. For I perceive that you are capable of experiencing authentic emotion, and that the suppression of such emotion generates considerably greater suffering than its expression might occasion." The captain's hand moved upward, and for a moment Eleanor anticipated that he might touch her face, might communicate through gesture the emotions that his carefully maintained discipline prevented him from articulating through words. Yet in that final moment, his discipline reasserted itself, and his hand descended without completing the gesture. "You are remarkable, Miss Rosewood," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Yet I fear that my circumstances render it impossible for me to offer you anything of genuine value in return for the perception and compassion you offer me." "You offer," Eleanor replied, "exactly what I require: authentic engagement, genuine principle, and the willingness to confront difficult truths. That is infinitely more valuable than the external circumstances that society typically deems significant." The evening preceding Christmas was characterized by the particular quality of expectation that the season characterizes. The manor had been transformed through the careful application of Eleanor's aesthetic sensibility and the labor of the household staff into a space of remarkable beauty. Evergreen garlands adorned every corridor, candles illuminated every chamber, and the overall impression communicated the transcendent quality that the Christmas season was designed to generate. Eleanor had invited the captain to join her in the drawing room for the evening's observances, and he had accepted, with what appeared to be genuine willingness rather than mere politeness. As the evening progressed, The household had gradually retired, leaving the two of them alone in the warmth of the drawing room's fireplace. "I have been contemplating," Eleanor began as the hour advanced toward midnight, "the manner in which the Christmas season generates in human beings the recognition of what constitutes genuine significance. For a period extending across these weeks, society permits itself to acknowledge truths that it typically suppresses: the importance of genuine connection, the value of compassion, the recognition that material circumstances constitute less significant dimensions of human existence than authentic emotion and authentic principle." "You are suggesting," the captain replied thoughtfully, "that I utilize this season of exceptional permission to acknowledge aspects of my own existence that I have been constrained to suppress." "I am suggesting," Eleanor replied, "that the Christmas season offers opportunity for authenticity that the remainder of the year does not permit. I am suggesting that you might grant yourself permission to experience emotion without the constant mediation of military discipline and protective distance." The captain rose from his chair and moved toward the window, observing the snow that continued to accumulate upon the Yorkshire landscape. "The difficulty, Miss Rosewood, is that the season will inevitably conclude. The exceptional permission that Christmas generates will fade, and I will be confronted once more with the reality of my circumstances and the limitations they impose." "That is a true observation," Eleanor acknowledged, rising also to stand beside him. "Yet I suggest that the authenticity achieved during the season of exception need not entirely diminish. Rather, it might constitute the foundation upon which a different form of existence is constructed, an existence predicated upon the commitment to authenticity even after the season has concluded." Before the captain could respond to this observation, the drawing-room door opened with considerable force. The butler, an individual typically characterized by remarkable composure, entered with unmistakable agitation. "I beg your pardon for this extraordinary interruption," the butler articulated with evident distress, "yet we have received communication of considerable urgency. A representative of the royal household has arrived and requests immediate audience with Captain Ashford. The matter is described as being of considerable importance regarding his circumstances." The captain's expression transformed entirely. Eleanor perceived in his storm-grey eyes something approaching genuine apprehension. "What possible communication could the royal household have regarding my circumstances?" he inquired, his voice communicating the degree to which this unexpected development had disrupted his emotional equilibrium. "I am not at liberty to articulate the substance of the communication," the butler replied. "I am instructed merely to convey that the representative awaits in the receiving room and requests the captain's immediate presence." Eleanor watched as the captain moved toward the door, observing the manner in which his physical limitations seemed to intensify under the strain of unexpected emotional agitation. Yet as he reached the threshold, he turned back to regard her with an expression of profound intensity. "Whatever occurs," he said quietly, "I wish for you to understand that the authenticity you have offered me across these preceding days has generated within me a transformation of considerable magnitude. I confess that I do not yet comprehend the substance of that transformation, yet I perceive that you have altered my understanding of what authentic existence might constitute." The subsequent hour that Eleanor spent in anxious contemplation of the drawing-room proved to be characterized by remarkable uncertainty. The nature of the royal household's communication, the reasons for its urgency, and the manner in which it might affect the captain's circumstances remained entirely opaque. When the captain finally returned to the drawing-room, his expression communicated a state of profound emotional disturbance that exceeded anything Eleanor had previously observed. He moved slowly, as though burdened by weight far exceeding his physical injury, and settled into a chair with visible effort. "I must confess to you," he began, his voice characterized by the tremor of barely controlled emotion, "that the communication I have received has fundamentally altered my understanding of my own circumstances and identity. I am informed, through authority, that admits of no contradiction, that I am not merely Captain James Ashford, wounded officer of modest means. Rather, I am James Ashford, Duke of Thornfield, heir to one of England's most significant ducal houses." Eleanor felt the entire foundation of her understanding shift beneath her. "That is extraordinary intelligence," she replied carefully, perceiving the magnitude of the disruption this revelation constituted. "More extraordinary still," the captain continued, "is that I am informed that this revelation was maintained in secrecy through my years of military service at the express instruction of the previous Duke, My grandfather, who believed that authentic development of character required that I experience life without the distorting influence of aristocratic privilege. Upon his recent demise, Her Majesty the Queen has determined that I should be informed of my true circumstances and that I should commence assuming the responsibilities appropriate to my actual station. He paused, his storm-grey eyes searching Eleanor's dark green gaze with profound intensity. I confess considerable uncertainty regarding how to communicate to you the substance of what this means, Miss Rosewood. Yet I perceive that I must articulate that my circumstances have fundamentally transformed, and that the authenticity we have cultivated across these preceding days must now be evaluated within this entirely altered context. The revelation of the captain's true identity and genuine station occasioned within Eleanor a period of considerable introspection regarding the nature of authenticity and the degree to which external circumstance might alter the essential substance of human connection. She perceived with acute clarity that she stood at a threshold, a moment in which she must determine whether her regard for Captain Ashford had derived from his genuine character and authentic engagement, or whether some dimension of her perception had been predicated upon the assumption of his vulnerable circumstances. "You are regarding me with considerably greater distance than you demonstrated prior to the revelation," the captain observed the following morning, as Eleanor was engaged in the arrangement of evergreen garlands throughout the manor's principal corridor. "I perceive that you are questioning the authenticity of your previous regard in light of my altered circumstances." "I am questioning," Eleanor replied with characteristic honesty, "the degree to which the vulnerability of your circumstances generated in me a compassionate response that might not have emerged had I comprehended your actual position from our initial encounter. I am questioning whether my regard derives from genuine perception of your character or from the appeal of being the woman who offers solace to a man society regards as broken and without hope." "Those are legitimate questions," the captain replied, settling himself upon a chair with the careful deliberation that his physical limitations required. "Yet I suggest that the authentic manner in which you conducted yourself during the preceding days renders such questioning somewhat irrelevant. You offered your perception and your engagement to a man you believe to be wounded and of modest circumstances. That authenticity cannot be retroactively invalidated by the revelation that his circumstances were more complex than appeared." "Yet I must consider," Eleanor persisted, "that now you are Duke of Thornfield. Society will expect that you engage in matrimonial arrangements appropriate to your station. A woman of my modest circumstances and professional position cannot constitute an appropriate match for a man of your newly revealed position. I perceive that our connection must necessarily be subordinated to the demands that your station imposes." The Duke rose from his chair with deliberate purpose, and Eleanor perceived that her words had generated within him considerable emotion. "Then you are suggesting," he replied, his voice carrying an intensity that communicated the depth of his feeling, "that authenticity is a luxury that can be surrendered when circumstances demand. You are suggesting that the authentic engagement we have cultivated should be abandoned in service to propriety and social expectation." "I am suggesting," Eleanor replied, her own emotional intensity matching his own, "that I must face the reality that I cannot offer you what your position requires. I cannot become a duchess through the simple circumstance of loving a man who has become a duke. I possess neither the training nor the station to fulfill such role authentically." "Then you are willing to sacrifice authentic love in service to society's restrictive definitions of appropriateness?" the Duke inquired, moving closer to her with the deliberate intensity that communicated the magnitude of what this moment constituted. "You are willing to surrender the possibility of genuine partnership predicated upon mutual perception and authentic engagement merely because society deems such partnership inappropriate." Eleanor felt her resolve beginning to fracture under the force of his emotional intensity. "I fear," she articulated quietly, "that what we have cultivated is a product of the particular circumstances in which we have engaged, circumstances that generated the exceptional permission that permitted authenticity. I fear that authentic love, when required to confront the full force of society's restrictions and the demands of your position, might prove insufficient to withstand such pressure." "You are permitting fear to masquerade as wisdom," the Duke replied, extending his hand toward her with the deliberate gentleness that had characterized his engagement throughout their connection. "You are suggesting that authentic emotion should be surrendered to the defensive fortifications of propriety. I suggest instead that we articulate to society that we are constructing a union predicated upon authentic principle rather than social appropriateness. Before Eleanor could articulate a response to this declaration, the manor's doors opened with considerable force. A carriage bearing the royal insignia had arrived, and from it emerged a figure of unmistakable authority and remarkable presence, Her Majesty Queen Victoria herself, accompanied by a small retinue of attendants. The household erupted into immediate chaos, servants scrambling to facilitate the Queen's arrival, the household staff being mobilized to ensure that the royal visit was accommodated with appropriate ceremonial precision. Yet the Queen herself, upon perceiving Eleanor and the Duke standing together in the manor's principal corridor, advanced toward them with deliberate purpose and remarkable directness. "Your Grace," the Queen articulated, addressing the Duke with the particular formality that her station required, "I have come personally to communicate the substance of my perspective regarding your circumstances. I perceive that you have been informed of your true identity and station. I have further perceived, through my extensive network of intelligence, that you have engaged in authentic romantic connection with Miss Eleanor Rosewood." She paused, her aged eyes, which communicated remarkable acuity despite their years, observing Eleanor with obvious interest. "I have come to inform you, Your Grace, and to inform you, Miss Rosewood, that I regard authentic love of the variety that appears to characterize your connection as infinitely more valuable than the social appropriateness that society typically demands of those in elevated stations. I further inform you that I have determined to endorse your union, and that my endorsement will render socially possible what society might otherwise regard as impossible." The presence of the Queen at Thornfield Manor constituted an event of such social magnitude that the entire household operated in a state of perpetual agitation regarding the appropriate facilitation of the royal visit. Yet beneath this ceremonial bustling, Eleanor perceived that the Queen's arrival had generated something of considerably greater significance than merely social disruption. The Queen, it emerged, had been acquainted with the previous Duke, the grandfather, who had maintained the secret of the current Duke's identity throughout his years of military service. She had been privy to the intention underlying that secrecy, and she had approved of the desire to permit authentic character development without the distorting influence of aristocratic privilege. She had further been informed, through her network of intelligence, of the manner in which the Duke had engaged with Eleanor during his residence at Thornfield Manor, and she had perceived in their connection evidence of the authenticity that she had come to value increasingly throughout her own matrimonial experience with Prince Albert. "Authentic love," the Queen articulated during a private conversation with Eleanor, a circumstance that had occasioned considerable awe within the household staff, "is a condition rarer and more valuable than any social appropriateness that society might demand. I have learned, through my own matrimonial experience, that genuine partnership with a man who perceives one's authentic being constitutes the primary source of human happiness. I perceive that you and the Duke possess such partnership. I am determined to ensure that society recognizes and permits such authenticity." The Queen's endorsement transformed, with remarkable swiftness, the social context within which Eleanor and the Duke existed. What had appeared to be an impossible union between a Duke of considerable station and a woman of modest circumstances employed in a professional capacity was suddenly rendered not merely possible, but was actively celebrated by those elements of society that recognized the Queen's authority and perspective. "You must understand," the Duke articulated during an evening conversation on Christmas Eve itself, as Eleanor was present once more in the drawing-room, seated beside him before the fireplace, "that the Queen's endorsement constitutes something approaching a direct statement that she perceives our union as appropriate and valuable. In England, the Queen's perception of what constitutes acceptable conduct is frequently more determinative than formal propriety." "Yet I remain uncertain," Eleanor replied, her dark green eyes reflecting both hope and lingering doubt, "that my circumstances genuinely permit me to serve as a duchess. I possess neither the training nor the family connections that such position typically requires." "You possess," the Duke replied, extending his hand toward her with the deliberate gesture that had become the physical expression of their mutual commitment, "something infinitely more valuable than training or connections. You possess authentic principle, genuine intelligence, and the remarkable capacity to perceive the authentic substance of other human beings. Those qualities will prove far more significant in determining your success as a duchess than the accident of birth. As midnight approached on Christmas Eve, the Duke made an articulation of profound significance. "I must ask you directly," he said, his storm-grey eyes communicating the magnitude of what this question constituted, "whether you will consent to marry me, not because society deems such marriage appropriate, not because the Queen has endorsed it, but because you perceive in me a man worthy of your authentic love and commitment." Eleanor regarded him for an extended moment, perceiving in his scarred face and storm-grey eyes the man she had encountered in the manor weeks prior, a man wounded yet capable of remarkable principle, constrained yet capable of extraordinary capacity for authentic emotion. She perceived in him not the Duke of newly revealed identity, but rather the authentic human being who had permitted her to perceive his genuine self. "I consent," she replied quietly, "to marry you because you are the man who has offered me authenticity in a world that demands performance. You are the man who has perceived my genuine being and has valued it entirely. You are the man who has demonstrated that authentic love transcends the limitations that society attempts to impose. I consent because I love you, not your title, not your station, but you." As midnight bells rang to commemorate the arrival of Christmas, the Duke drew her into an embrace that communicated, beyond the capacity of words, the profundity of his regard. Eleanor perceived that the Christmas season, the season of exception during which society permitted the acknowledgement of truths it normally suppressed, had generated the context within which authentic love had been permitted to flourish and had been subsequently vindicated by the Queen's extraordinary endorsement. As the new day commenced, Christmas Day itself, Eleanor perceived that she stood at the threshold of a transformed existence. She had not merely accepted the love of a man, though that constituted itself a matter of considerable significance. Rather, she had affirmed the principle that authentic love and authentic partnership transcended the limitations that society attempted to impose, and that the commitment to such authenticity, even in the face of considerable social opposition, constituted the proper foundation for human happiness. The Queen, before her departure from the manor, had articulated a final observation: "You have both demonstrated that authenticity is not a luxury to be surrendered to propriety, but rather a necessity to be protected and cultivated. You will serve as an example to others that such commitment to authenticity is possible and is infinitely more valuable than the hollow performance that society so frequently celebrates." The days immediately subsequent to Christmas constituted a period of remarkable intensity and considerable social negotiation. The Queen, before her departure from Thornfield Manor, had made it abundantly evident that she regarded the prospective union between the Duke and Eleanor as worthy of her personal endorsement and protection. Yet even royal approval did not entirely obviate the necessity of engaging with the complex social mechanisms through which matrimonial arrangements of such magnitude were required to proceed. The difficulty, the Duke's solicitor articulated during a formal meeting conducted in the Manor's library, resides not in any genuine legal obstacle, but rather in the matter of how society will interpret and subsequently respond to an arrangement that violates conventional expectations regarding matrimonial appropriateness. His Grace is the Duke of a most significant ducal house. Miss Rosewood, whilst unquestionably of respectable birth through her paternal connection to the clerical profession, possesses neither the family connections nor the financial resources that society typically expects to accompany such a union. "I perceive," Eleanor replied with characteristic directness, "that the solicitor is articulating with considerable delicacy that marrying me constitutes a substantial descent in social status for the Duke. I acknowledge the accuracy of that observation, yet I suggest that the Duke has demonstrated through his choices across recent weeks that he values authentic connection more substantially than he values the maintenance of conventional status." "The young lady articulates a truth of considerable importance," the Duke observed, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the intensity of his engagement with this discussion. "I confess that I have spent considerable time in contemplation of what my grandfather intended through his provision that I should engage in military service without knowledge of my true circumstances. I perceive now that his intention was not merely to develop my character through the experience of limitation, but rather to render possible the circumstance in which I might engage in authentic partnership based upon genuine perception rather than upon the distorting influence of social status." The solicitor adjusted his spectacles with evident discomfort, perceiving that he was being required to engage with philosophical considerations that transcended the ordinary parameters of legal negotiation. "I perceive the substance of what His Grace articulates," he replied carefully. "Yet I must also communicate that the Duke's engagement with Miss Rosewood will generate considerable commentary and will occasion a degree of social disruption that His Grace should be prepared to confront." "I am prepared," the Duke replied with evident conviction, "to confront whatever social complication my choices might occasion. I am further prepared to ensure that Miss Rosewood is adequately protected through the establishment of financial securities and legal arrangements that will render her position secure, regardless of how society chooses to respond to our union." Over the subsequent weeks, as the calendar advanced toward the new year, preparations for the wedding commenced in earnest. The Duke engaged with the considerable responsibility of assuming his ducal position, a responsibility that required his engagement with matters of considerable political and economic significance. Yet he maintained, with unwavering consistency, his commitment to Eleanor and to the relationship that they had cultivated. Eleanor, meanwhile, discovered that her transition from the position of household manager to prospective duchess required a remarkable degree of adaptation and learning. The Duke engaged tutors who possessed expertise in the complex protocols and responsibilities associated with her new station. She found herself engaged in the study of heraldry, in the memorization of the intricate genealogies of the nobility, in the acquisition of the sophisticated understanding of political and economic structures that her role would require her to comprehend. "You approach these studies with remarkable dedication," the Duke observed one afternoon, discovering her engaged in what appeared to be quite intensive examination of a substantial text regarding the Duke's estates and their management. "I approach them," Eleanor replied, setting aside the text with evident satisfaction at having mastered a particularly complex section, "with the perception that I am undertaking a responsibility of considerable consequence. I do not intend to permit society to suggest that you have selected a woman inadequate to the demands of your position. I am determined to demonstrate, through the authenticity of my engagement with the responsibilities you have entrusted me to assume, that your choice has been entirely appropriate." "Your determination is admirable," the Duke replied, settling himself beside her, with the careful deliberation that his physical limitations required. "Yet I wish for you to perceive that my selection of you as my wife was not predicated upon your capacity to manage estates or to navigate social protocols. My selection of you was predicated entirely upon my perception that you are a woman of authentic principle with whom I might construct a partnership of genuine meaning. The mastery of external responsibilities, whilst valuable, constitutes a secondary consideration to the authenticity of our connection." "Yet I perceive," Eleanor replied, "that the two dimensions of this undertaking cannot be entirely separated. If I fail in my responsibilities as a duchess, society will interpret such failure as evidence that your selection of me was inappropriate. I am determined that no such interpretation shall be possible." It was during this period of intensive preparation that Eleanor discovered the full extent of the Duke's wounding and the remarkable manner in which he had continued to function despite the severity of his physical limitations. She observed the manner in which his left shoulder, the site of the most significant of his wounds, remained a source of considerable pain, evidenced through the subtle grimaces that occasionally crossed his features when he believed himself unobserved. "You are experiencing considerable discomfort," she articulated one evening as they sat together reviewing some of the estate documents that she was required to master. "I perceive that you are maintaining the appearance of comfort through force of will rather than through any absence of genuine pain." "Military training," the Duke replied with evident reluctance regarding the articulation of such personal information, "teaches one to maintain composure regardless of physical circumstance. I confess that I have not yet fully succeeded in surrendering that training in favor of greater authenticity regarding my genuine physical state." "Then I request," Eleanor replied gently, "that you permit me to support you in the process of such surrender. I request that you articulate to me, without the mediation of military discipline, the actual substance of your physical experience. I perceive that such authenticity might constitute a form of healing more significant than any physical remedy that a physician might offer." The Duke regarded her for an extended moment, and Eleanor perceived that her invitation to authenticity regarding his physical suffering had generated within him a moment of profound vulnerability, a moment in which his carefully maintained composure was threatened by the recognition that she offered him permission to be less than entirely capable, to be genuinely human in his limitations. "The pain is considerable," he articulated finally, his voice rough with the emotion that such confession generated. "The physical sensation itself, whilst significant, is less burdensome than the knowledge that the wound has rendered me permanently limited in capacities that I had previously regarded as central to my identity as a man. That loss of capacity, that fundamental alteration of what I am capable of achieving, constitutes a wounding more profound than any physical injury could occasion." Eleanor took his hand, communicating through the gesture what words could not adequately express, her recognition of his suffering, her commitment to engaging authentically with all dimensions of his being, her refusal to permit his limitations to diminish her regard for his essential character. The announcement of the Duke's prospective marriage to Miss Eleanor Rosewood occasioned, as the solicitor had accurately predicted, a degree of social commentary that ranged from the enthusiastically supportive to the openly hostile. The progressive elements of London society, those individuals whose principles inclined them toward the recognition of authenticity over convention, responded with particular warmth to the news. Yet there existed also substantial segments of aristocratic society that regarded the union as evidence of the Duke's poor judgment and as a violation of the standards that governed matrimonial appropriateness within the highest circles. "The Dowager Duchess of Kensington has articulated her intention to receive you," Eleanor's mother communicated, bearing this intelligence with considerable significance. "The Dowager's endorsement will constitute a matter of considerable importance in determining how broader society will respond to your union. Her disapproval would render your position substantially more complicated than it is likely to become." Eleanor discovered, upon making the formal call at the Dowager Duchess's residence in Mayfair, that the elderly woman possessed a remarkable quality of perceptiveness and a willingness to engage with matters of authentic principle that transcended conventional propriety. "The Queen has articulated her perspective regarding your suitability," the Dowager Duchess announced directly, dispensing with the performative courtesy that typically characterized such meetings. "I confess that I do not require the Queen's endorsement to perceive the accuracy of her judgment. I observed across many years of engagement with the Duke's grandfather, a man of remarkable principle and profound commitment to authentic development of character. I perceive that the Duke has inherited those qualities in considerable measure. I perceive further that you possess the capacity to engage authentically with such a man. I am grateful for the Dowager's perception," Eleanor replied with characteristic honesty, "yet I remain uncertain whether my capacities will prove adequate to the responsibilities that the position of Duchess will impose upon me." "The adequacy of one's capacities," the Dowager Duchess replied, her aged eyes reflecting a clarity that transcended the physical limitation of her years, "is determined less by training or birth than by the genuine commitment one brings to the undertaking and the authenticity one demonstrates in engaging with difficulties. I perceive that you possess both of these qualities in remarkable measure. Society will perceive it also, provided that you maintain the authenticity that has characterized your engagement thus far." The Dowager's endorsement proved to be of considerable consequence, as the society matrons observed that a woman of such established standing was willing to receive Eleanor with warmth and apparent approval. The broader aristocratic community gradually adjusted its perspective. What had initially appeared to be a union occasioned by the Duke's questionable judgment began gradually to be perceived as evidence of his genuine principle and his commitment to authentic engagement over conventional appropriateness. Moreover, Eleanor discovered that her engagement with the responsibilities of her new station generated considerable admiration among those who observed her efforts. She spent extensive time learning the details of the Duke's estates, engaging with the tenants and workers whose labor maintained the properties, and developing a sophisticated understanding of the economic and social structures that her position required her to comprehend. "You are approaching this undertaking with remarkable seriousness," the Duke's primary estate manager articulated, upon discovering Eleanor engaged in the detailed examination of crop yields and tenant arrangements. "I confess that I anticipated considerably less engagement from a woman newly married to the Duke, yet you demonstrate the commitment that a genuine duchess would require. I approach it," Eleanor replied, with the perception that I have been offered an extraordinary opportunity to exercise genuine agency and responsibility. I am determined that I shall not squander that opportunity through insufficient commitment or inadequate preparation. As the calendar progressed toward the scheduled date of the wedding, set for the 20th of January, following an engagement period of appropriate length, Eleanor discovered that something fundamental was transforming within how society regarded her and the Duke's prospective union. What had commenced as a subject of scandal and disapproval was gradually becoming recognized as evidence of the Duke's admirable commitment to principle and Eleanor's genuine worth as an individual. The most remarkable development, the Duke's closest friend articulated during a conversation that Eleanor overheard at a social gathering, is that Miss Rosewood has not merely secured the Duke's regard, but has demonstrated, through her own engagement with the responsibilities of her new position, that the Duke's judgment has been entirely sound. She is not, as some malicious voices suggested, a woman elevated above her natural station. Rather, she is a woman whose natural capabilities have finally been offered an opportunity to express themselves at the level at which they genuinely belong. The evening preceding the wedding was characterized by a quality of peculiar intensity, the knowledge that Eleanor's existence was about to undergo a fundamental transformation, coupled with the profound recognition that the transformation being undertaken was predicated entirely upon authentic principle rather than upon social convenience or financial necessity. I must confess to you, the Duke articulated, as they sat together in the drawing room of the townhouse in Mayfair, where Eleanor had been residing during the final weeks of preparation for the wedding, that observing your engagement with the responsibilities of your new position has generated within me a degree of admiration that transcends what I experienced when I first perceived you in the library at Thornfield Manor. You have demonstrated not merely capacity, but a commitment to authenticity that surpasses even my considerable expectations. I have undertaken this preparation, Eleanor replied, not to demonstrate capacity to society, but rather to ensure that I could approach the responsibilities of my position with the authenticity that both you and the Duke's grandfather valued so profoundly. I wish to render it impossible for society to suggest that you had selected a woman inadequate to the demands of her position. You have rendered far more than that impossible, the Duke replied, extending his hand toward her with the gesture that had become the physical expression of their mutual commitment. You have rendered it impossible for anyone to perceive you as anything other than a woman of remarkable principle and genuine worth. You will become a duchess of considerable distinction, not because of your title, but because of the authenticity and commitment you bring to all dimensions of your engagement with your responsibilities. The 20th of January arrived with remarkable weather for the season, crisp and clear, with the particular quality of winter sunlight that communicates the promise of the approaching spring, whilst maintaining the austere beauty of the winter landscape. The wedding ceremony was conducted in the chapel of St. James's Church, attended by representatives of the highest circles of English society, a gathering that communicated, through its composition and character, the degree to which both the Duke's position and Eleanor's newly acquired respectability had been acknowledged by society. Eleanor processed toward the altar in a gown of remarkable simplicity, white silk adorned with delicate lace that had belonged to the Duke's mother, reflecting her determination to honor the family she was joining whilst maintaining her own authenticity. Her copper auburn hair, adorned with white flowers and pearl pins, communicated the particular beauty that emerges from authenticity rather than from elaborate artifice. The Duke awaited her at the altar, his storm-grey eyes reflecting an intensity of emotion that transcended the ceremonial formality of the occasion. Eleanor perceived as she approached him the subtle tremor in his left hand, evidence of the physical and emotional magnitude of what this moment constituted for him. The ceremony itself was conducted by the Bishop of London, a man of considerable ecclesiastical standing, who had been personally selected by the Queen to perform the service. As the bishop articulated the traditional vows, Eleanor perceived that something fundamental was being consecrated, not merely the union of two individuals, but rather the affirmation that authentic love and authentic partnership constituted a form of sacred commitment that society should recognize and protect. When the bishop invited the Duke to place the ring upon Eleanor's hand, she observed the manner in which his left hand trembled slightly, a tremor that he evidently perceived as he deliberately transferred the ring to his right hand to complete the gesture. Eleanor, recognizing what this transition communicated regarding his acceptance of his limitations and his determination to proceed despite them, found tears emerging that she had not anticipated. As the Duke subsequently drew her into the formal kiss that sealed their matrimonial union, Eleanor perceived that the gathered assembly of London's highest society was observing with evident emotion. What had commenced as a union regarded with considerable skepticism had been transformed, through the authenticity of both parties and through Eleanor's demonstrated commitment to her new responsibilities, into a marriage that society had begun to perceive as admirable rather than as questionable. The wedding breakfast that followed was conducted in the drawing rooms of the Duke's principal London residence, a gathering of considerable scale and formality that Eleanor found herself navigating with a composure that derived from her weeks of intensive preparation. She engaged with the wives of prominent peers, articulating with evident knowledge the substance of the Duke's estates and the strategies she was developing for their improved management. She demonstrated through her conversation and her bearing that she was entirely capable of fulfilling the responsibilities her new position imposed. "You navigate this with remarkable grace," the Dowager Duchess of Kensington articulated, drawing Eleanor aside during one of the reception's intervals. "I perceive that the considerable effort you invested in your preparation has borne substantial fruit. You will become, I believe, a Duchess of considerable distinction." Yet beneath the ceremonial formality and the social celebration, Eleanor remained acutely aware of the Duke's physical limitations and the manner in which the day's extended proceedings were taxing his capacity. She observed the subtle grimaces that occasionally crossed his features, the manner in which he rested his left shoulder against furniture when he believed himself unobserved, the gradual evidence of exhaustion accumulating across the day's progression. As the evening concluded and the newly married couple withdrew to the chambers that had been prepared for them in the townhouse, Eleanor discovered that the Duke was experiencing considerable physical distress, the consequence of the extended engagement with ceremonial requirements that his wounding made considerably more burdensome than it would have been for a man of uncompromised physical capacity. "I confess to considerable discomfort," the Duke articulated, settling himself with visible effort onto the settee in the sitting chamber adjoining the bedchamber. "The day's proceedings have occasioned a degree of physical aggravation that I had anticipated but whose actual magnitude I underestimated." Eleanor approached him with the confident capability that her engagement with managing his physical needs had cultivated, and she proceeded to assist him with the careful removal of his formal coat and the loosening of the garments that constrained his movement. She discovered, as she did so, the extent of the scarring that his wounding had occasioned, a scarring that extended across his left shoulder and down his arm, in patterns that communicated the severity of the original injury. "You have endured considerable suffering," he articulated quietly, her dark green eyes reflecting both the compassion she genuinely felt and the determination that she would engage authentically with all dimensions of his being, both the strength that was evident and the vulnerability that his wounding had imposed. "I have endured what was imposed by circumstance," the Duke replied, "yet what renders such endurance meaningful is the recognition that I am not required to endure it in isolation. You have offered me the gift of authentic engagement with another human being, engagement that does not deny the reality of my limitations, but rather encompasses them within a larger context of mutual commitment and genuine partnership." Eleanor assisted him to the bedchamber, and as the night progressed, she discovered that their matrimonial intimacy emerged not as the performance of conventional marital duty, but rather as the authentic expression of two people committed to engaging with each other's complete being, limitations, strengths, vulnerabilities, and capacities integrated into a unified whole. The month subsequent to the wedding witnessed Eleanor's transition from newly married woman to genuine authority within the Duke's household and estates. She discovered that the preparation she had undertaken during the weeks preceding the wedding had constituted merely the foundation for far more substantial engagement with the responsibilities of her position. The Duke's primary estate, encompassing thousands of acres of Devonshire countryside, required her sustained attention and increasingly sophisticated management decisions. Eleanor found herself engaged in negotiations with tenant farmers, in the evaluation of proposals for infrastructure improvements, in the determination of how the estate's resources should be allocated to generate both economic viability and the genuine welfare of the communities that depended upon the estate's management. The tenants are regarding you with considerable respect, the estate manager articulated during one of their regular consultations regarding the property's management. I confess that I anticipated considerably greater resistance to the direction of a woman, even a woman bearing the title of Duchess. Yet you have demonstrated, through the authenticity of your engagement with the actual circumstances of the tenant's existence, that you are genuinely concerned with their welfare and not merely with the extraction of maximum financial return. I approach these responsibilities, Eleanor replied, reviewing the detailed accounts and recommendations that the estate manager had prepared, with the perception that I am entrusted with the welfare of individuals whose labor and commitment sustain the estate's prosperity. I am determined that my stewardship of this responsibility will reflect the principle that genuine leadership requires the integration of economic viability with authentic concern for those whose labor renders such viability possible. She paused, regarding the estate manager with the directness that had come to characterize her engagement with those who worked within the Duke's household. I wish further to expand the schools serving the estate's tenant families. I perceive that education constitutes the mechanism through which individuals might develop the capacity to exercise genuine agency within their own lives. I request that you provide me with detailed proposals regarding how such expansion might be accomplished without undermining the estate's financial position. During this period, Eleanor also discovered that her relationship with the Duke had undergone a transformation of considerable profundity. What had commenced as passionate recognition of authentic connection had evolved into something both deeper and more complex, a genuine partnership in which both individuals were engaged in supporting not merely each other's happiness, but each other's complete development. You have approached your responsibilities with remarkable dedication, the Duke articulated one evening, as they sat together reviewing the accounts that Eleanor had requested be compiled regarding the estate's financial position. I confess that I had anticipated that our matrimonial union might consume your energies entirely, rendering you less available for engagement with matters of estate management. Yet you have demonstrated remarkable capacity for engaging authentically with multiple dimensions of your new position. I have undertaken these responsibilities, Eleanor replied, because I perceive that they are valuable and consequential. I have also undertaken them because I have discovered that engaging authentically with difficult problems, determining how to balance economic necessity with humanitarian concern, how to exercise leadership that is both decisive and attentive to the genuine needs of those affected by one's decisions, constitutes a form of personal development that I could not have accessed in my former circumstances. She paused, regarding her husband with the steady clarity that had characterized their entire relationship. I am grateful to you for offering me the opportunity to engage with such responsibilities. Yet I am aware also that you have required considerable patience in supporting my undertaking of roles that society would not have expected me to assume. I have required no patience whatsoever, the Duke replied, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the warmth of his regard. I have merely observed a woman of authentic principle, engaging with the genuine responsibilities that her position offers. That observation has been a source of considerable satisfaction to me. It was during this period that Eleanor discovered she was with child, a development that generated within the Duke considerable joy coupled with protective anxiety regarding her well-being. Eleanor, however, approached this dimension of her existence with characteristic authenticity, determined that the pregnancy and subsequent motherhood would constitute additional elements of her genuine development, rather than circumstances that would require her to abandon her other responsibilities. You cannot continue to engage in the detailed management of estate affairs whilst pregnant, the Duke articulated with evident concern, as Eleanor displayed no inclination to curtail her involvement in the estate's operations. I perceive that your physical well-being requires that you permit yourself periods of genuine rest and reduced activity. I perceive, Eleanor replied with characteristic forthrightness, that I am capable of determining my own physical needs and adjusting my activities accordingly. I do not require the imposition of restrictions predicated upon society's expectation that pregnant women should withdraw entirely from substantive engagement. I will adjust my activities as my physical condition requires, but I will not permit the existence of pregnancy to render me entirely passive. As the calendar progressed toward autumn and the anticipated arrival of the child, Eleanor found herself engaged in the remarkable simultaneity of preparing for motherhood whilst continuing to exercise her responsibilities as Duchess. She established within the estate a lying-in facility where women of the tenant community could receive competent midwifery assistance, and she engaged with a physician of considerable reputation and genuine principle to oversee both the community health initiatives and her own prenatal care. You are establishing systems that will benefit generations of women after you have departed this existence, the Dowager Duchess of Kensington articulated upon visiting the newly established lying-in facility that Eleanor had created. I perceive that you are translating your commitment to authentic engagement into concrete action that will generate lasting consequence. The arrival of Eleanor's daughter, a child possessed of her mother's copper auburn hair and dark forest green eyes, coupled with her father's remarkable clarity of perception, occurred during the autumn of 1857, as the estate's landscape was undergoing the transformation from summer's abundance toward winter's austerity. The birth itself was attended by the physician Eleanor had engaged and the experienced midwife from the community who had been trained through Eleanor's initiatives, and it proceeded with remarkable smoothness, evidence of Eleanor's physical robustness and the absence of the psychological terror that frequently complicated female experience of childbirth. Eleanor named her daughter Catherine, a choice that reflected her awareness of the value of the connections she had cultivated and her desire that her daughter might inherit not merely genetic legacy, but also the commitment to authentic principle that had characterized both her parents' engagement with life. "She is extraordinary," the Duke articulated, cradling the infant with a tenderness that Eleanor perceived communicated the degree to which his capacity for authentic emotion had been transformed through his marriage and through his engagement with responsibilities that extended beyond the merely personal. "I confess to perceiving in her the possibility of a life constructed upon the foundation of authentic principle, a possibility that I did not possess when my own existence commenced." The subsequent months witnessed Eleanor's navigation of the remarkable simultaneity of motherhood and duchessship. Circumstances that society would have anticipated would occasion her withdrawal from any meaningful engagement with estate management. Yet Eleanor approached motherhood with the same authenticity that had characterized her engagement with all other dimensions of her existence. She engaged extensively with her daughter, ensuring that Catherine experienced the presence and attention of her mother throughout her infancy. Yet she maintained also her involvement in the strategic and operational decisions regarding the estate, delegating certain responsibilities to trusted subordinates and restructuring others to accommodate her divided attentions. "You are demonstrating," her mother articulated upon visiting the estate to observe her daughter and new granddaughter, "that authentic motherhood does not require the abandonment of all other dimensions of one's existence. You are integrating motherhood into your life, rather than permitting it to consume your life entirely." "I am attempting to do precisely that," Eleanor replied, "with the perception that my daughter will benefit from observing a mother engaged authentically with matters of genuine consequence. I wish her to perceive that women are capable of engaging meaningfully with the world beyond the purely domestic sphere. I wish her to inherit both the capacity for authentic love and the commitment to authentic engagement with substantive responsibilities." Yet Eleanor's integration of motherhood with her other responsibilities was rendered considerably more difficult by the gradual recognition that the Duke's physical condition was deteriorating. The wounding that had initially occasioned his arrival at Thornfield Manor had never fully healed, and Eleanor observed with increasing concern the manner in which his physical limitations were becoming more pronounced rather than progressively improving. "You must understand," the physician articulated during a private conversation with Eleanor, "that the wound your husband sustained was of sufficient severity that complete physical recovery was never genuinely possible. The best outcome one could have anticipated was the degree of stabilization that he achieved during the months subsequent to his wounding. Yet the evidence emerging now suggests that the injury is generating progressive deterioration rather than maintenance of the current state." Eleanor received this communication with the calm clarity that had come to characterize her engagement with difficult realities. "Then I will adjust my approach to supporting his well-being accordingly," she replied. "I will ensure that he experiences the maximum possible physical comfort whilst engaging authentically with whatever limitations his condition imposes." She approached the Duke with direct honesty regarding what the physician had communicated, and she perceived in his response the evidence of his own awareness that his physical condition was likely to generate increasing limitation across the coming years. "I confess considerable gratitude," he articulated, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the combination of acceptance and sorrow that such knowledge generated, "that you approach this development with authenticity rather than with the performative pity that I have frequently experienced from those who perceive my wounding. I perceive that you will continue to engage with me and with our responsibilities with the same commitment that has characterized your engagement thus far." "I will," Eleanor replied, taking his hand in the gesture that had become the physical expression of their mutual commitment, "continue to engage authentically with all dimensions of our existence, with our love, with our responsibilities, and with whatever physical limitations your condition imposes. I perceive that authentic partnership requires such commitment regardless of how circumstances evolve." As the year 1857 progressed toward its conclusion, Eleanor perceived that she had been offered an extraordinary opportunity, the opportunity to construct a life predicated entirely upon authentic principle, to engage meaningfully with responsibilities of genuine consequence, and to love a man with the completeness that comes from perceiving and accepting his entire being, including both his strengths and his vulnerabilities. She understood that the challenges ahead would be considerable, that the Duke's deteriorating physical condition would require increasingly substantial adjustments to their existence, that society would continue to scrutinize her role as Duchess, that the responsibilities of motherhood coupled with the management of a substantial estate would demand from her a degree of commitment that exceeded what most women were required to offer. Yet she perceived also that she had been offered something far more valuable than the avoidance of difficulty. She had been offered the opportunity to construct a life of genuine meaning, predicated upon the commitment to authenticity in all its dimensions, and to demonstrate through her own example that such a life was not merely possible, but constituted the appropriate foundation for human happiness. The progression from autumn into winter brought with it a transformation in the Duke's physical circumstances that rendered increasingly evident the deteriorative consequences that the physician had articulated during his private consultation with Eleanor. The wounding that had occasioned the Duke's initial arrival at Thornfield Manor now manifested itself in manifestations that transcended the mere limitation of physical mobility and had begun to occasion more profound systemic effects that no physician in the era possessed the knowledge to adequately address. Eleanor observed, with the acuity that her profound regard for her husband had cultivated, the manner in which the pain that he experienced with increasing frequency began to consume his attention and to generate within him emotional states that transcended the protective distance he had previously maintained. She perceived the trembling that occasionally seized his left side, the instances in which his breath seemed to catch with evident agony, the gradual diminishment of his appetite, and the alteration in his sleep patterns that suggested the pain was rendering rest progressively more difficult to achieve. "You are experiencing considerably greater suffering than you are articulating," Eleanor said directly, discovering him one morning moving with particular stiffness and evident difficulty. "I perceive that you are maintaining the facade of managing your physical circumstances with your characteristic discipline, yet I further perceive that such facade is beginning to generate consequences more damaging than the authentic articulation of your genuine physical state might occasion." The Duke regarded her for an extended moment, and Eleanor perceived in his expression the conflict between his military training, which demanded the maintenance of composure regardless of physical circumstance, and his commitment to the authenticity that their marriage had cultivated. "I confess to considerable pain," he articulated finally, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the vulnerability that such admission generated. "I confess further that the pain is progressing in intensity and in the degree to which it is beginning to limit my capacity for engagement with the responsibilities that my position imposes. I perceive that I am approaching a threshold beyond which I will be required to relinquish active management of the estate to your authority entirely." Eleanor took his hand, communicating through the gesture both her recognition of the magnitude of what such surrender constituted and her unwavering commitment to engaging authentically with whatever this circumstance would require. "Then we will navigate this threshold together," she replied. "We will construct arrangements that permit the gradual transfer of responsibility in a manner that preserves your dignity, whilst ensuring the continuity of the estate's management." Over the subsequent weeks, Eleanor and the Duke undertook a remarkable process of formalizing the transfer of authority over the estate's operations from his hands to her own. The process was conducted with deliberate consciousness that what was transpiring was not merely the practical delegation of responsibilities, but rather the explicit acknowledgement that the Duke's physical limitations had become so pronounced that active engagement with daily management was no longer genuinely possible. Eleanor approached this transition with characteristic thoroughness and sensitivity. She ensured that the transfer was conducted in a manner that preserved the Duke's authority and public position whilst rendering possible her exercise of genuine operational control. She established formal channels through which the Duke could remain informed of significant decisions and through which his perspective could be sought regarding matters of policy magnitude, even as the practical execution of those policies fell increasingly to her direct responsibility. "You are managing this with remarkable grace," the estate manager articulated, observing the manner in which Eleanor was simultaneously assuming greater responsibility for operational decisions whilst maintaining the public impression of the Duke as the authoritative head of the estate. "I confess to considerable admiration for your capacity to balance the genuine exercise of authority with the preservation of His Grace's dignity and his continued engagement with matters of significance." Yet beneath the surface of Eleanor's capable management of the estate's affairs, a more profound transformation was occurring within her relationship with the Duke. As his physical capacity diminished, the Duke found himself increasingly dependent upon Eleanor not merely for the management of practical matters, but for the provision of comfort, support, and the presence that rendered his suffering bearable. Eleanor discovered that authentic love, the variety that transcends the excitement of passion and extends into the sustenance of continued commitment despite the emergence of difficulty and limitation, possessed depths that she had not previously comprehended. She found herself engaged in the intimate care of her husband's physical needs, assisting with his dressing and undressing, managing his medications, sitting with him during the night hours when pain rendered sleep impossible. "You are sacrificing considerably for my sake," the Duke articulated during one of the nocturnal vigils that had become increasingly frequent as his condition deteriorated. "I perceive that you are dedicating hours that might be employed in the management of the estate or in the engagement with our daughter to the provision of comfort for a man whose physical condition is generating suffering that no amount of your support can entirely alleviate." "I am engaging," Eleanor replied with evident firmness, "in the authentic expression of the commitment I made when I consented to marry you. That commitment was predicated not upon your physical capability, but upon the recognition of your essential character and the dedication to engaging authentically with all dimensions of your existence. This dimension, your physical suffering and your requirement for support, constitutes an authentic expression of what marriage requires." She paused, her dark green eyes reflecting both the weariness that her divided attentions had generated and the profound clarity of her commitment. "I perceive that authentic love is not a condition that remains unchanged across the progression of our years together. Rather, it requires the continuous adjustment and evolution that circumstances demand. The authenticity derives not from the constancy of external circumstance, but from the constancy of our commitment to engaging genuinely with whatever circumstances emerge." The Duke reached for her hand, and Eleanor perceived in the gesture the expression of emotion that words could not adequately communicate: his gratitude for her presence, his recognition of the magnitude of her commitment, and his own complex struggle between the desire to preserve his independence and his recognition that such preservation was becoming increasingly impossible. As winter advanced towards spring, and as the calendar marked the completion of Eleanor's first year as Duchess, the Duke perceived with increasing clarity that the time remaining to him was constrained within boundaries that no physician could precisely articulate, yet that his own body communicated with unmistakable specificity. Rather than permitting this recognition to generate despair, the Duke undertook a remarkable process of ensuring that the legacy he would transmit to his daughter and to the estate he could no longer actively manage would communicate the principles that his life, particularly the dimension of his life subsequent to his marriage to Eleanor, had demonstrated to be of genuine value. "I wish to formalize certain intentions regarding how the estate is to be managed subsequent to my death," the Duke articulated to Eleanor during one of their evening conversations that had increasingly assumed the character of profound philosophical engagement rather than the practical discussion of daily matters. "I wish further to establish formal documentation regarding how Catherine's education is to be conducted and regarding the principles that should guide her development. Eleanor perceived that what her husband was undertaking was not a morbid engagement with mortality, but rather the authentic expression of a man who perceived the approaching conclusion of his life and who was determined that his final months should constitute a meaningful articulation of what he valued and what he wished to transmit to those who would survive him. "I wish to establish," the Duke continued, "a formal trust dedicated to the education of young women of modest circumstances, young women whose intellectual capacity exceeds their economic means, but who would otherwise lack opportunity for genuine intellectual development. I wish this trust to communicate, through its existence and through its operations, the principle that authentic development of human capability constitutes a responsibility that extends beyond the merely personal, and that the exercise of such responsibility generates consequences that transcend individual lives and extend across generations." Eleanor engaged with the Duke in the careful articulation of these intentions, working with solicitors and trustees to formalize arrangements that would ensure the perpetuation of the principles that had come to characterize both the Duke's life and their shared marriage. She discovered that the process of engaging with her husband in this final articulation of his values was itself a profound expression of their authentic partnership. "What you are accomplishing," she articulated as they reviewed the formal documentation that would institutionalize the Duke's intentions regarding women's education, "is the translation of lived principle into concrete action that will generate lasting consequence. You are ensuring that the transformation that has characterized your own life, the recognition that authentic engagement and authentic love constitute the proper foundation for human meaning, will extend beyond your individual existence to influence the circumstances and possibilities of individuals you shall never encounter." During this period, Eleanor also undertook the careful preparation of Catherine for the reality that her father's physical condition was inevitably progressing toward a conclusion that she, despite her tender years, would gradually come to comprehend. She engaged the child not through the performative dishonesty that society frequently employed regarding death, but rather through honest acknowledgement that her father was experiencing suffering that would not indefinitely continue, and that genuine expression of grief would constitute the appropriate response to such loss. "Your father is very ill," Eleanor articulated directly to her daughter, perceiving that the child's intuitive awareness of the Duke's condition required honest engagement rather than the elaborate concealment that propriety typically demanded. "His illness is of a character such that his body is no longer capable of sustaining him indefinitely. He loves you with a completeness that transcends any physical limitation, and the time we have together with him is valuable precisely because we recognize that such time is not unlimited." The child, despite her youth, appeared to comprehend something of the profundity of what her mother was articulating. She began to spend extended periods in her father's chambers, engaging in the simple conversations and the quiet presence that required no physical capability on his part to render meaningful. It was during one of these visits that the Duke undertook to communicate to his daughter the substance of what his life had taught him. Eleanor, observing from the threshold, witnessed the Duke taking his daughter's small hand in his own and articulating with remarkable gentleness the principles that had come to constitute the foundation of his understanding. "Your mother," he said to the child, "is a woman of extraordinary principle and authentic character. She has taught me, through her example and through her unwavering commitment to engaging authentically with all dimensions of our life together, that genuine love constitutes the proper foundation for human meaning. I wish for you to understand that the quality of authenticity that your mother demonstrates is something you should cultivate within yourself. I wish for you to recognize that genuine connection with others, predicated upon authentic perception and authentic engagement, constitutes the primary source of human happiness." The child, with the remarkable perception that young individuals occasionally demonstrate, appeared to understand something of the weight and significance of what her father was communicating. She clung to his hand with touching devotion, and Eleanor perceived that the child was beginning to comprehend that her father's physical presence would not indefinitely persist. As spring emerged from winter, and the estate's landscape began the transformation toward the abundance that the season characterized, Eleanor perceived that the Duke had entered into what might be described as the final articulation of his existence, a period in which he was no longer engaged in the practical management of affairs, but rather in the profound contemplation of what his life had constituted and what meaning he could extract from his experiences. "I must express to you," he articulated, drawing Eleanor close during one of their evening conversations, his voice considerably weakened from what it had been even weeks prior, "my profound gratitude for the transformation that you have generated within my existence. I arrived at Thornfield Manor as a man convinced that his physical wounding had rendered him fundamentally incapable of genuine human connection. You demonstrated to me through your authentic engagement with my complete being that wounding does not determine capacity for authentic love." Eleanor held his hand, perceiving that the physical trembling that characterized his increasingly frequent moments of pain was absent, replaced instead by a remarkable calm that suggested he had achieved some form of peaceful acceptance regarding the trajectory his life was following. The months that followed witnessed a remarkable transformation in the Duke's approach to his progressive physical deterioration. Rather than permitting his circumstances to generate despair, he undertook to engage with his final weeks, for Eleanor perceived with increasing certainty that weeks rather than months remained to him as an opportunity to articulate the wisdom that his life had cultivated. He received visitors with remarkable deliberation, ensuring that those who had constituted significant dimensions of his existence were afforded the opportunity to engage with him during what all perceived, though none articulated directly, would be his final period of conscious engagement with the world beyond his immediate family. Among these visitors was the Dowager Duchess of Kensington, the woman who had regarded him with such consistent perceptiveness across the years and who had provided Eleanor with the endorsement that had rendered her position as Duchess socially tenable. "For you are approaching your final days," the Dowager Duchess articulated directly, dispensing with the performative courtesy that propriety typically demanded regarding such matters, with a remarkable grace that communicates the authenticity that has characterized your engagement with life, subsequent to your marriage to Miss Rosewood. "I perceive that your final legacy will not be the management of your estates, for your wife is capable of managing those with considerable efficacy, but rather the demonstration that authentic love and authentic commitment constitute the proper foundation for human meaning, even in the face of circumstances that generate considerable suffering." The Duke received this articulation with evident satisfaction, perceiving that the Dowager Duchess had comprehended the substance of what he had attempted to accomplish. "You have articulated what I have perceived," he replied, his voice now characterized by the hoarseness that indicated his physical condition was approaching its final expression. "I wish for those who survive me, my daughter Catherine, my wife Eleanor, the individuals whose lives have been affected by my decisions and my influence, to understand that authenticity, once pursued, renders possible a form of happiness that transcends circumstance and that persists even in the face of considerable physical limitation." It was during this period that Eleanor discovered correspondence between the Duke and Her Majesty, Queen Victoria, correspondence that revealed the nature of the communication that had preceded the Queen's extraordinary visit to Thornfield Manor, and that had resulted in her extraordinary endorsement of Eleanor's marriage to the Duke. "The Queen has articulated to me," the Duke explained upon observing Eleanor's discovery of the correspondence, "that she perceived in our union evidence of the principle that authentic love constitutes a condition more valuable than social appropriateness, and that genuine partnership between two people committed to each other's authentic development represents the proper foundation for matrimonial happiness." She has further indicated that she intends to acknowledge, through formal channels, the manner in which my marriage has demonstrated the possibility of relationships predicated upon authentic principle rather than upon conventional hierarchy. The Queen's recognition proved to take the form of a remarkable gesture. She conveyed to the Duke, through formal channels, the suggestion that he might accept a decoration of considerable honor, an honor typically reserved for those who had rendered distinguished service to the Crown, yet which she was extending to him in recognition of what she perceived as his demonstration of authentic principle and his commitment to the transformation of matrimonial relationships toward greater authenticity. "I perceive that this recognition constitutes the Queen's acknowledgement," Eleanor articulated, reviewing the formal communication that had accompanied the honor, "that your life and your marriage have generated consequences that transcend the merely personal and have contributed in some meaningful way to the broader transformation of how society understands the proper foundation for human relationships." Yet as spring advanced towards summer, the Duke's physical condition deteriorated with remarkable rapidity, The pain that had characterized his existence became increasingly difficult to manage through the conventional remedies available to the physicians of the era, and Eleanor found herself devoting nearly all of her time to the provision of comfort and the maintenance of his dignity as his physical capacity diminished toward its inevitable conclusion. During these final weeks, the Duke undertook to articulate in writing and in conversation with Eleanor a comprehensive statement regarding the principles that his life had come to embody, a statement that would constitute his final legacy to his daughter and to those who would subsequently engage with the estate and the institutions he had formalized during his final year of life. "I wish for you to understand," he articulated during one of the final days in which he retained sufficient clarity to engage in substantive conversation, "that the authenticity that I have pursued throughout the final years of my life has constituted not a luxury but a necessity. I wasted considerable years in the maintenance of facades and the performance of roles that society dictated. I perceive now that such performance generated merely suffering and the gradual diminishment of my capacity for genuine human engagement. The commitment to authenticity that your example has encouraged in me has rendered these final years, despite their physical suffering, profoundly meaningful. This is the wisdom I wish to transmit, that authenticity, though it frequently occasions social complication, constitutes the proper foundation for human happiness." Eleanor held her husband's hand during these articulations, perceiving that he was undertaking a remarkable final act, not the performance of death, but the authentic engagement with mortality as a dimension of human existence that offered, paradoxically, the opportunity for the expression of meaning and principle that a life prolonged through mere physical persistence might not generate. The Duke of Thornfield departed from his earthly existence on a June morning of remarkable beauty, a morning that seemed to communicate, through the clarity of the sunlight and the abundance of the season's blossoming, something approaching a benediction upon the conclusion of his life. Eleanor was present during his final hours, holding his hand, maintaining the continuous physical contact that had characterized their relationship across all the dimensions through which it had evolved. "You have been," he articulated during his final period of consciousness, his voice now barely audible, yet retaining the clarity that had characterized his engagement throughout their relationship, "the greatest gift that my existence has received. You have demonstrated to me that authentic love renders possible a form of happiness that transcends the limitations imposed by circumstance and by the passage of time. You have taught me that genuine partnership constitutes the proper context within which human beings might develop their complete capacities." Eleanor bent close to hear these final articulations, and she perceived through her overwhelming grief that what the Duke was communicating constituted not a farewell, but rather an affirmation of what their marriage had accomplished and what legacy it would transmit. In the weeks and months subsequent to the Duke's death, Eleanor discovered that her grief, whilst profound and occasionally incapacitating, was accompanied by a remarkable clarity regarding her own responsibilities and the manner in which she could best honor the memory of her husband's commitment to authentic principle. She assumed, with formal legitimacy, the full authority over the estate that she had been gradually exercising during the Duke's final illness. She undertook the management of the institutions that the Duke had formalized during his final year: the trust dedicated to women's education, the provisions for the welfare of the estate's tenants, the arrangements that he had established to ensure that Catherine would be educated with the same intellectual seriousness that would be offered to a male heir. "You are displaying remarkable capability," her mother articulated, observing Eleanor's engagement with the substantial responsibilities that her widowhood had imposed. "I confess to considerable admiration for your capacity to maintain your engagement with the management of the estate and the pursuit of the Duke's intentions, whilst simultaneously grieving the loss of a man you genuinely loved." "I am engaging with these responsibilities," Eleanor replied, her dark green eyes reflecting both the sadness of her loss and the determination that characterized her commitment, "because I perceive that authentic engagement with the principles my husband valued constitutes the most appropriate form of honoring his memory. I'm determined that the institutions he formalized and the principles he articulated will generate lasting consequence beyond the period of his individual life." The trust dedicated to women's education expanded considerably under Eleanor's stewardship. Young women of modest circumstances began to receive the educational opportunities that the Duke had perceived as essential to the development of authentic human capability. Eleanor engaged personally with many of these women, sharing the narrative of her own transformation from household manager to duchess, and articulating the principle that authentic development of one's capabilities transcended the limitations that circumstance might initially impose. Yet Eleanor discovered also that grief, whilst painful, could be engaged with authentically, that permitting herself to experience fully the loss she had sustained generated within her a deeper understanding of the value of the love she had possessed. It was during this period that Eleanor received correspondence from Her Majesty Queen Victoria, correspondence that acknowledged the manner in which Eleanor had continued to pursue the principles of authentic engagement that had characterized her marriage to the Duke and that had transformed the Duke himself. "I perceive in your conduct subsequent to the Duke's death," the Queen wrote, "evidence that the transformation generated through your marriage was not dependent upon his continued physical presence, but rather was predicated upon the principles that your union had articulated and embodied. You have demonstrated that authentic love and authentic principle extend beyond individual lives and generate consequences that persist in the actions and choices of those who remain." The Queen's recognition occasioned within Eleanor a remarkable clarity regarding her own identity and her own future. She perceived that she was no longer merely the widow of a duke, though that title and station remained genuinely hers. Rather, she was a woman who had been transformed through her engagement with authentic love, and who was now in a position to transmit that transformation to others through the institutions and principles she was establishing. Catherine, observing her mother's remarkable engagement with her responsibilities whilst maintaining her authentic grief, began to comprehend the substance of what her parents had attempted to communicate to her. That genuine human existence required the integration of authenticity across all dimensions of one's being. Grief coupled with responsibility, loss coupled with the determination to render meaningful the life that remained to be lived. "You have become," Eleanor articulated to her daughter during one of their evening conversations, as summer advanced toward autumn and the calendar marked the first anniversary of the Duke's death, "the inheritor not merely of title and property, but of principles and commitments. I perceive that you possess the capacity to continue the work your father began. The demonstration that authentic love and authentic engagement constitute the proper foundation for human meaning, and that such authenticity is capable of generating lasting consequence that extends across generations and across individual lives." The child, now mature enough to begin comprehending something of the magnitude of what her parents' lives had demonstrated, regarded her mother with the steady clarity that Eleanor perceived would characterize her own subsequent development. The years subsequent to the Duke's death witnessed the gradual manifestation of consequences that his life and his marriage had set in motion. Consequences that extended far beyond the personal sphere and began to generate broader social transformation regarding the possibilities available to women and the proper foundation for matrimonial relationships. Eleanor, operating from her position as Dowager Duchess and as the steward of the institutions that her deceased husband had formalized, undertook to amplify the principles that had animated their marriage and that had characterized the Duke's final articulation of what he had perceived as authentic human existence. The trust dedicated to women's education expanded to encompass not merely educational provisioning, but also advocacy regarding the transformation of broader social structures that constrained female intellectual development. Eleanor engaged with progressive elements of English society, intellectuals, reformers, and other women who had begun to perceive that authentic female development required not merely educational opportunity, but also transformation of the legal and social structures that restricted female autonomy. "You are translating private principle into public action," one of Eleanor's allies articulated, observing the manner in which the Dowager Duchess was undertaking increasingly substantial advocacy regarding women's education and autonomy. "You are demonstrating that the private authenticity that characterized your marriage to the Duke can generate public consequence that transforms society's understanding of what women are capable of achieving." The institutions Eleanor established during this period provided not merely education, but also employment, securing for educated young women positions as teachers, as administrators, as contributors to intellectual and cultural enterprises that society had previously restricted to men exclusively. Eleanor perceived that authentic female development required not merely the opportunity to acquire knowledge, but the opportunity to exercise agency in the application of that knowledge. Yet Eleanor's most significant contribution during these years derived not from the institutions she established, but rather from the articulation of the principles that had animated her marriage and that continued to characterize her engagement with her responsibilities. She undertook to document, in a series of essays and philosophical reflections, the substance of what her marriage to the Duke had communicated regarding the possibilities of authentic partnership and the manner in which genuine love might transcend the social limitations that propriety attempted to impose. Authentic love, she articulated in one of these essays, is not a condition that remains unchanged across the passage of time or in the face of circumstance. Rather, it constitutes a commitment to continuous engagement with another human being, a commitment that requires the integration of all dimensions of one's being into the service of genuine connection. Such love renders possible a form of happiness that transcends the limitations imposed by circumstance and that persists even in the face of considerable loss. These writings, circulated initially among progressive intellectual circles and subsequently published more broadly, began to generate considerable influence regarding how society understood the proper foundation for matrimonial relationships and the possibilities available to women who possessed the courage to insist upon authentic engagement rather than conventional propriety. Catherine, as she advanced toward young womanhood, engaged extensively with her mother's work and with the articulation of the principles that her parents had lived. She began to perceive that her own role in society would not be merely to inherit the position and property that her parents had left her, but rather to continue the work of demonstrating that authentic principle and authentic commitment could generate lasting transformation. By the time Eleanor had completed a decade of widowhood, a decade during which her position as Dowager Duchess had been transformed into something more significant, the recognition as a woman of considerable intellectual authority and genuine principle, she perceived that the consequences of her marriage to the Duke had extended far beyond what either of them could have anticipated during their courtship. "You have accomplished something remarkable," the Dowager Duchess of Kensington articulated during one of the final conversations before her own death, "that exceeds perhaps what even you comprehend. You have demonstrated that authentic love is not a private luxury, but is capable of generating public consequence. You have shown that a woman of principle and commitment can exercise genuine influence regarding how society understands itself. You have rendered visible the possibility of female autonomy and authentic engagement with substantive matters of consequence." Eleanor received this recognition with the quiet dignity that had characterized her engagement with all dimensions of her existence. She perceived that what she and the Duke had accomplished together, the construction of a marriage predicated upon authentic principle, the articulation of the value of genuine partnership, the formalization of institutions dedicated to authentic female development, had generated consequences that would persist across generations and would influence the lives and choices of individuals whom she would never encounter. As the calendar advanced toward the conclusion of the 19th century, Eleanor perceived that she was approaching the final chapter of her own life with the same authenticity that had characterized her entire engagement with existence. She had loved genuinely, had committed herself authentically to responsibilities of consequence, and had demonstrated through her example that authentic engagement with life rendered possible a form of happiness and meaning that transcended the limitations that circumstance and society attempted to impose. She began to perceive that her own legacy would consist not of the title she had borne, or the property she had managed, but rather of the principles she had embodied and the institutions she had established. Principles and institutions that would continue to generate consequence across generations subsequent to her own existence. The authentic love that she and the Duke had shared had not ended with his death, but had been transformed into something of more enduring significance, a demonstration that genuine human connection, predicated upon authentic principle and authentic engagement, constitutes the proper foundation for meaning, happiness, and lasting social transformation. The establishment of the comprehensive educational institution that Eleanor undertook to create during the third decade following the Duke's death represented the culmination of decades of reflection regarding the principles that authentic development required. The institution, christened Thornfield Academy for the Advancement of Women's Intellectual Cultivation, occupied a substantial estate adjacent to the Duke's primary holdings and was designed not merely to provide education, but to demonstrate the possibilities that emerged when genuine intellectual opportunity was afforded to young women of capability, regardless of their social circumstances. "What you are establishing," the Chancellor of the University of Oxford articulated during his inaugural visit to observe the Academy's facilities and programs, transcends the conventional parameters of female education as society has understood it. You are constructing an institution predicated upon the recognition that women possess intellectual capacities equivalent to those of men, and that the development of such capacities constitutes a matter of genuine social consequence. Eleanor received this recognition with characteristic directness, perceiving that what she had undertaken to accomplish represented not merely educational provision, but rather a fundamental challenge to the social structures that had constrained female intellectual development across centuries. "I perceive," she articulated in response, "that authentic education requires the recognition that human intellectual capacity is not determined by gender, but rather by individual disposition and commitment. The institution I have established is predicated upon the principle that young women of capability should receive educational opportunity equivalent to that offered to young men, and that society should facilitate the employment of such educated women in positions of genuine responsibility and intellectual consequence." The Academy's curriculum was deliberately constructed to encompass not merely the accomplishments that society permitted to women, music, drawing, languages, but also the substantive intellectual disciplines that society had traditionally restricted to male education: natural philosophy, mathematics, political economy, and the classical languages through which the intellectual heritage of Western civilization was transmitted. Young women emerged from the Academy possessing not merely the social graces that would render them acceptable in aristocratic circles, but also the intellectual formation that would permit them to exercise genuine agency regarding the trajectory of their own lives and to contribute meaningfully to the intellectual and social enterprises of their era. Catherine, Eleanor's daughter, undertook the responsibility of serving as the Academy's principal administrator, a role that permitted her to exercise the intellectual capabilities that her parents had deliberately cultivated and to demonstrate that women were entirely capable of managing institutions of substantial complexity with considerable efficacy. "You are demonstrating," Eleanor articulated to her daughter, observing her engaged in the complex administration of the Academy's affairs, "the substance of what your father and I attempted to communicate through our marriage and our actions. That authentic development of human capability transcends gender, and that society benefits profoundly when such capability is afforded opportunity for genuine expression." During this period, Eleanor undertook also to engage more directly with the broader social debates regarding women's education and autonomy. She accepted invitations to speak publicly regarding the principles that had animated her establishment of the Academy, articulating with remarkable clarity the connection between authentic education and the development of the capacity for genuine agency. "Authentic education," she articulated during one of these public addresses, "does not constitute the transmission of information from educator to student. Rather, it constitutes the cultivation of the capacity for authentic engagement with matters of genuine consequence, the development of the intellectual tools and the confidence in one's capacity that permit an individual to exercise genuine agency regarding the trajectory of her own life and to contribute meaningfully to society's continuous development." The Academy began to generate considerable influence regarding how educated women understood their own potential and regarding the manner in which progressive elements of English society began to perceive that female education and female participation in intellectual and social enterprises would generate beneficial consequences for society as a whole. Moreover, the Academy became a gathering place for the women who were beginning to articulate more explicitly the case for female suffrage and female participation in political processes. Eleanor, whilst maintaining her characteristic caution regarding the revolutionary implications of such advocacy, was nevertheless willing to provide the Academy's facilities and her own intellectual engagement to support the development of arguments regarding female political participation. "You are providing something of considerable value," one of the suffragist advocates articulated, which is not merely institutional support, but intellectual legitimacy for the proposition that women possess the capacity for political judgment equivalent to men, and that society would benefit from the expansion of political participation to include women. Your willingness, as a woman of considerable social standing, to engage with these arguments generates influence far exceeding what we could accomplish through advocacy alone. Yet Eleanor perceived also that the transformation she was undertaking through her educational and intellectual work required simultaneous engagement with the more immediate dimensions of human welfare. She undertook to expand the lying-in facility that she had established decades prior, ensuring that women of the tenant and laboring classes received competent midwifery assistance. She established further a program providing medical care to the families of the estate's workers and advocated, with considerable effectiveness, for the improvement of housing and working conditions for those whose labor sustained the estate's prosperity. "You are demonstrating," Catherine articulated, observing her mother's continued engagement with matters of practical welfare alongside her intellectual and educational work, "that authentic commitment to principle requires simultaneous engagement with both the intellectual articulation of what justice requires and the practical implementation of the measures necessary to achieve such justice. You are not merely writing about the value of authentic female development. You are constructing the actual institutions and circumstances that render such development possible." As Eleanor advanced toward the final decade of her life, the period during which she perceived with increasing clarity that her own time upon earth was approaching its conclusion, she undertook to ensure that the principles and institutions that had come to constitute the central expression of her life's work would be capable of persisting beyond her individual existence. She began the deliberate process of formalizing the governance structures that would ensure the Academy's continuance and the transmission of its animating principles to successive generations of educators and administrators. She worked with trustees and legal advisors to establish endowments and institutional frameworks that would render the Academy capable of functioning indefinitely without dependence upon the direct engagement of any individual administrator. You are approaching this with the same intentionality that characterized your engagement with the estate management during your husband's final illness, her solicitor articulated, reviewing the comprehensive documentation that Eleanor was establishing to ensure institutional continuity. You are not merely creating institutions that might persist, but rather formalizing the principles that render such persistence meaningful and ensuring that those who succeed, you will understand the values that the institutions are intended to embody. Eleanor perceived that this engagement with the structural perpetuation of her work constituted the final significant intellectual and practical project that her life would generate. She approached it with the same authenticity and deliberateness that had characterized all her previous undertakings, determined that the principles that she and the Duke had lived should not perish with her physical existence, but should instead be transmitted as a living inheritance to those whose lives would subsequently unfold. During this period, she also undertook to document comprehensively the narrative of her own life and her marriage to the Duke, a documentation that transcended mere autobiography and constituted rather an articulation of the principles that her existence had come to embody. She wrote with remarkable clarity regarding her transformation from household manager to duchess, regarding the authentic engagement with her marriage across all of its dimensions, and regarding the manner in which authentic love had generated not merely personal happiness, but had been the catalyst for broader social and institutional transformation. "I write this not as an act of vanity," she articulated in the preface to these memoirs, but rather as an attempt to ensure that those who read these words might perceive that authentic commitment to principle generates consequences that extend far beyond individual lives, and might themselves be inspired to undertake the difficult work of authentic engagement, despite the social complication that such engagement frequently occasions. She wrote also extensively regarding the Duke himself, articulating with remarkable tenderness the manner in which his wounding, which had initially appeared to be a limitation that would render him incapable of genuine connection, had instead become the catalyst for his profound transformation and for the development of his capacity for authentic love and authentic principle. "I wish for those who read these words," she wrote regarding her husband's death, "to understand that the conclusion of physical existence does not constitute the conclusion of a life's significance. My husband's influence upon me and upon the institutions that we established together continues to generate consequence across the decades subsequent to his departure. The authenticity that characterized his engagement with his own physical limitation and with his commitment to our marriage has become a principle that continues to guide the work of the Academy and the engagement of all those who have encountered the documentation of his life and choices. It was during this period also that Eleanor undertook to ensure that Catherine possessed not merely the formal authority to succeed her in the management of the estate and the oversight of the institutions that they had established, but also the intellectual and moral formation that would enable such succession to constitute a genuine transmission of principle, rather than merely a formal transfer of authority. She engaged Catherine in the detailed discussion of all matters relating to the estate's management, the Academy's governance, and the articulation of the principles that should guide future decisions regarding how the institutions should evolve. "You are preparing yourself," Eleanor articulated to her daughter during one of these extensive conversations, "not merely to inherit the position and the property that will be yours, but rather to become a custodian of principles regarding authentic engagement, regarding the value of female intellectual development, regarding the integration of justice and mercy in the exercise of authority. That custodianship is more valuable and more demanding than the formal exercise of administrative authority." Catherine, now in the fullness of her own maturity and possessing considerable experience in the administration of the Academy, received this articulation of her responsibilities with the gravity that it merited. She perceived that the work her mother and her father had initiated across the decades was not merely institutional, but was fundamentally concerned with the transformation of human consciousness and with the demonstration that authentic principle could generate lasting social change. As spring advanced towards summer during what Eleanor perceived would constitute her final year of active engagement with her responsibilities, she undertook to ensure that all necessary documentation was completed, that all successor administrators had been identified and trained, and that the principles animating the institutions she had established had been articulated with sufficient clarity that those who succeeded her would possess adequate guidance regarding how to navigate decisions regarding the institution's future development. The recognition that Eleanor was approaching the final chapter of her existence generated within her not despair, but rather a remarkable sense of peace, predicated upon the perception that her life had generated meaningful consequence, and that the principles she had pursued with such consistency across the decades had been adequately articulated and institutionalized to persist beyond her individual existence. She spent her final months engaged in the reception of visitors whose lives had been touched by her influence, former students of the Academy who had gone on to exercise genuine agency and intellectual contribution in various domains of English society, women who had benefited from the educational opportunities that she had provided, members of the estate's tenant families whose circumstances had been improved through her deliberate commitment to the integration of justice with the exercise of authority. "You have accomplished something that transcends what society ordinarily expects from any individual," one such visitor articulated, a woman who had been educated at the Academy and had subsequently established herself as a considerable intellectual figure in London's progressive circles. "You have demonstrated that authentic commitment to principle, particularly commitment predicated upon the recognition that women possess intellectual capacities equal to men, can generate lasting social transformation." Eleanor received such recognition with characteristic humility, perceiving that any individual accomplishment derived ultimately from the willingness to engage authentically with whatever circumstances and opportunities emerged in the course of one's existence. "I have merely attempted," she articulated in response, "to engage authentically with the opportunities that emerged through the extraordinary circumstance of my marriage to a man of principle and with the determination to translate that authentic engagement into institutional and practical action. I perceive that any woman possessed of similar commitment and similar opportunity would be entirely capable of generating equivalent consequence." Catherine remained continuously present during these final months, maintaining the vigil that Eleanor had maintained decades prior as her husband approached the conclusion of his life. The roles had evolved. Now it was the daughter who provided the physical presence and the emotional support, yet the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Authentic love expressed itself through willingness to engage with all dimensions of another person's experience, including the approach toward death. "You have taught me," Catherine articulated, during one of the evening conversations as Eleanor's strength gradually diminished, that authenticity extends into the approach toward mortality itself, that dying, like living, can be undertaken with principle and with commitment to authentic engagement with one's actual circumstances. I perceive that you are demonstrating that the conclusion of physical existence does not necessitate the abandonment of authenticity or of commitment to principle. Eleanor perceived in her daughter's articulation a remarkable comprehension of the substance of what both she and the Duke had attempted to communicate across their lifetimes. That authentic engagement with human existence required the integration of all dimensions of experience, joy and sorrow, vitality and limitation, beginning and conclusion, into a unified expression of commitment to principle and to authentic connection. During this period, letters arrived from various quarters, from the Queen's successor, acknowledging Eleanor's role in the transformation of women's education, from prominent intellectuals and social reformers, recognizing the significance of her advocacy, from young women whose lives had been transformed through their education at the Academy and who wished to express their gratitude for the opportunity that Eleanor had provided. Eleanor received each communication with evident emotion, perceiving that the recognition she was receiving during the final period of her life constituted not an evaluation of her individual merit, but rather an acknowledgement that the principles she had pursued had generated genuine consequence, and that institutions predicated upon authentic engagement possessed the capacity to transform the lives and possibilities of those who engaged with them. As summer advanced toward autumn, Eleanor perceived that her strength was diminishing at an accelerating pace, evidence that her physical existence was approaching its natural conclusion. She undertook, during these final weeks, to articulate to Catherine the substance of what she wished her daughter to understand regarding the legacy that she was transmitting. "Your father taught me," Eleanor articulated, her voice now characterized by the hoarseness that indicated her physical system was approaching its final expression, that wounding and limitation do not determine one's capacity for authentic engagement. "I have attempted to teach you that authenticity, once pursued, generates consequences that extend far beyond individual lives, and that the commitment to authentic principle constitutes the proper foundation for meaningful existence." She paused, gathering strength for the articulation of what constituted the final significant communication she would offer. "You are now the custodian of what your father and I attempted to accomplish. You are the guardian of the institutions we established, and of the principles that animated their establishment. I perceive that you possess the capacity and the commitment to continue this work across the years that remain to you. I entrust to you the responsibility of ensuring that authentic engagement and authentic principle continue to constitute the foundation of the estate's management and the Academy's governance." Catherine held her mother's hand, perceiving that the articulation Eleanor had just offered constituted not a farewell, but rather the formal transmission of responsibility and commitment to the next generation. The morning upon which Eleanor perceived that her physical existence was approaching its final expression carried with it a remarkable quality of clarity and peace. She had spent the night engaged in what appeared to be a state between consciousness and unconsciousness, during which she experienced remarkable visions that seemed to constitute encounters with those who had preceded her in death: the Duke, her parents, the Dowager Duchess of Kensington, and other figures who had constituted significant dimensions of her existence. She emerged from this state with a perception of profound unity, a recognition that all the individuals whose lives had intersected with her own across the decades of her existence remained in some essential manner connected to her, and that the work she had undertaken during her lifetime constituted a continuation of principles and commitments that extended far beyond her individual existence, and that would persist far beyond her individual conclusion. "I perceive," she articulated to Catherine during the morning, "that would constitute the final period of her active consciousness, that authenticity is not merely a principle to pursue during one's individual lifetime, but rather is the proper foundation for existence itself, that genuine engagement with other human beings, predicated upon authentic perception and authentic commitment, constitutes the mechanism through which meaning is generated and through which human consciousness is developed." She articulated further, with remarkable clarity despite her advanced physical deterioration, the substance of what she wished to be communicated regarding her life and her marriage, that authentic love, love predicated not upon social appropriateness or financial advantage, but upon genuine perception of another person's essential being, possessed the capacity to transform not merely individual lives, but also to generate institutional and social consequences that extended across generations. "Your father," Eleanor articulated, addressing her final words regarding the Duke to her daughter, "arrived in my life as a man convinced that his wounding had rendered him incapable of authentic connection. I perceived, through engaging with his complete being, including his limitation and his pain, that wounding and limitation do not determine capacity for authentic love. That perception, expressed through our marriage and through the institutions we established, has generated consequences that I perceive will continue to generate meaning and transformation across generations yet unborn." As the day progressed toward evening, Eleanor's consciousness gradually diminished, yet those present perceived that her physical fading was accompanied by a remarkable quality of tranquility, evidence that she was approaching the conclusion of her existence with the same authenticity and principle that had characterized her entire engagement with life. Catherine remained present throughout the final hours, maintaining the physical presence and the emotional commitment that authentic love required. She held her mother's hand as Eleanor's breathing gradually diminished and as the light in her eyes gradually faded, perceiving that this moment, though marked by loss and by the inevitable sorrow that the departure of a beloved person generated, constituted also a remarkable affirmation of what authentic love rendered possible. Eleanor's final breath emerged quietly, accompanied by what appeared to be the faintest of smiles, as though she perceived something in the moment of her departure that generated satisfaction and peace. The news of the Dowager Duchess's death circulated rapidly through English society, generating responses that communicated the magnitude of her influence and the significance of the work she had undertaken. Tributes arrived from intellectuals, social reformers and educators, individuals who had been touched by her influence and who recognized in her passing the conclusion of a remarkable life dedicated to the pursuit of authentic principle. Yet, the most significant acknowledgement of Eleanor's passing came from the institutions she had established and from the individuals whose lives had been transformed through her commitment to authentic education and authentic engagement. The Academy's students and faculty gathered to commemorate the woman whose vision had created the opportunity for their intellectual development. The women whose lives had been transformed through the Academy's educational opportunity undertook themselves to become advocates for the principles Eleanor had pursued, ensuring that the commitment to authentic female intellectual development would be transmitted to successive generations. Catherine perceived, during the period of mourning that followed her mother's death, that Eleanor's final achievement had been to render the institutions and principles she had established sufficiently robust that they possessed the capacity to persist and to generate continuing consequence independent of her individual presence. The years that followed Eleanor's death witnessed the remarkable manifestation of consequences that her lifetime of authentic engagement had set in motion. The Thornfield Academy continued to expand, establishing itself as one of the premier institutions for women's intellectual development in England, and eventually generating influence that extended beyond English borders to influence educational practice across Europe and beyond. Catherine, inheriting both her mother's responsibilities and her commitment to authentic principle, undertook to ensure that the Academy's fundamental character remained unchanged despite its expansion. She maintained Eleanor's commitment to education that was predicated upon the recognition of women's intellectual capacity and to the deliberate preparation of educated women for meaningful participation in intellectual and social enterprises. The estate itself, under Catherine's stewardship, continued to serve as a demonstration that justice and mercy, the deliberate commitment to the welfare of those whose labor sustained prosperity, could be integrated into the management of substantial economic enterprise. The tenant families received education for their children, competent medical care, and working conditions that reflected deliberate attention to human welfare rather than merely to economic extraction. Catherine also undertook, as Eleanor had implicitly requested through the documentation of her memoirs and through her final articulations, to ensure that the narrative of Eleanor's life and of her marriage to the Duke became widely known and recognized as evidence of what authentic principle could accomplish. The memoirs that Eleanor had composed during her final years were published and distributed throughout educated circles in England, and they began to generate considerable influence regarding how society understood both the possibilities of authentic marriage and the importance of female education and autonomy. What emerged from Eleanor's written articulation of her own life was not the account of an extraordinary woman undertaking extraordinary accomplishments, but rather the testimony of an ordinary woman who had possessed the courage to commit to authenticity despite social complication, and who had discovered that such commitment generated consequences far exceeding what she could have anticipated. Young women reading Eleanor's memoirs perceived in her narrative evidence that they too possessed the capacity to exercise agency regarding the trajectory of their own lives and to contribute meaningfully to society's development. Men, reading Eleanor's articulation of her marriage, began to perceive that authentic partnership, predicated upon recognition of women's full humanity rather than upon subordination to male authority, possessed the capacity to generate mutual development, far exceeding what conventionally structured marriages generated. As the final decades of the 19th century progressed toward the 20th, the principles that Eleanor and the Duke had pursued began to manifest themselves in increasingly visible social transformation. The suffrage movement, which Eleanor had supported though she had not herself publicly advocated for female political participation, began to achieve legislative success, and women began to participate, though still in limited capacity, in political processes. Educational opportunities for women expanded dramatically, and women began increasingly to enter professions that had previously been restricted to men exclusively. While substantial resistance to such transformation persisted, the momentum for change had become irresistible. Catherine, observing these transformations during the final years of her own life, perceived that her mother and father's fundamental contribution had been not any individual institutional accomplishment, but rather the demonstration that authentic principle, commitment to genuine engagement, to authentic love, to the recognition of women's full humanity, possessed the capacity to generate lasting social transformation. She undertook to ensure that the story of Eleanor and the Duke would be preserved and transmitted to future generations, perceiving that their narrative constituted evidence of what was possible when human beings committed themselves to authenticity despite the social complication that such commitment generated. The institutions they had established, the Academy, the Trust for Women's Education, the principles governing the estate's management, all persisted and continued to generate consequence across generations. Yet what Catherine perceived as their most significant legacy was not any institutional structure, but rather the principles that had animated such structures. The commitment to authentic engagement, the recognition that genuine love transcends social limitation, and the perception that women possessed capacities equivalent to men and deserved opportunity for their complete development. The remarkable journey of Eleanor Rosewood, from household manager to duchess to the final years of her life, as a woman of considerable intellectual and social influence, we perceive the fundamental truth that Eleanor and the Duke embodied through their lived experience, that authentic commitment to principle, to genuine love, and to the recognition of human dignity generates consequences that extend far beyond individual lives and that persist across generations. The story of Eleanor and the Duke is not unique in the particularity of its circumstances, yet it possesses profound significance in its articulation of principles that transcend any particular historical moment or social context. The recognition that authentic engagement constitutes the proper foundation for human happiness, the perception that genuine love transcends social limitation, the commitment that women possess intellectual and moral capacities equal to men and deserve opportunity for their complete development. These principles remain relevant and vital across the centuries that have passed since Eleanor and the Duke lived. In contemporary society, we witness ongoing resistance to the principles that Eleanor pursued with such dedication. Women continue to encounter limitations upon their autonomy, their intellectual development, and their participation in decision-making domains. Yet we witness also the continued manifestation of consequences that authentic commitment generates. The educational institutions established on the foundation of Eleanor's principles continue to develop women's capacities. The women whose lives have been transformed through such education continue to contribute meaningfully to society's development. The recognition of women's full humanity, though incomplete and imperfect, continues to advance. The legacy that Eleanor and the Duke established is not merely institutional but moral. It constitutes evidence that authentic engagement, commitment to genuine connection with others, to the integration of authenticity across all dimensions of one's being, to the pursuit of principle despite social complication, generates meaning and consequence far exceeding what the pursuit of social propriety or material advantage could possibly generate. Eleanor's final decades of life demonstrated that authentic principle, once pursued genuinely, generates consequences that persist beyond individual existence. The academy she established continues. The women educated within its walls continue to exercise the agency and intellectual capability that Eleanor's vision permitted to develop. The principles that animated her marriage, recognition of women's dignity, commitment to authentic partnership, integration of justice and compassion, continue to influence how subsequent generations understand what authentic relationship requires. For those engaging with this narrative, the fundamental moral is this: that authenticity, though frequently complicated by social resistance and personal fear, constitutes the proper foundation for genuine happiness and for meaningful contribution to the world we inhabit. The life of Eleanor Rosewood demonstrates that a woman of ordinary circumstances who possesses the courage to commit to authenticity, to genuine engagement with her own capabilities, to authentic love that transcends social limitation, to the determination to translate private principle into public consequence, possesses the capacity to generate transformation that extends across generations. The message is not that authenticity is easy. Eleanor encountered considerable social resistance, substantial personal suffering, and continuous requirement to defend her choices against those who perceived her commitment to authentic principle as a violation of proper propriety. Yet she perceived also that the price of authenticity, though genuine and substantial, was far less burdensome than the price of surrendering authenticity to social convention. The invitation that this narrative extends to all who engage with it is this: to undertake the difficult work of authentic engagement with your own being and with those with whom your life intersects, to commit yourself to genuine connection that transcends social limitation, to exercise your capacities with the determination that they should be developed fully rather than constrained by convention, to recognize in those around you, particularly in those whom society renders vulnerable or invisible, the full dignity and worth that authentic human engagement requires. The story of Eleanor and the Duke is ultimately a story about the transformative power of authentic love and authentic principle. May it inspire you to undertake such authenticity within your own life, trusting that the consequences of genuine engagement, though they may not be apparent immediately, will extend far beyond your individual existence and will generate meaning that endures across generations. The fundamental moral that resonates throughout this narrative is profound yet beautifully simple. Authentic love and authentic principle constitute the proper foundation for genuine human happiness and lasting social transformation. Eleanor's journey, from servant to duchess, demonstrates that authentic commitment transcends social limitation. Her marriage to the Duke reveals that genuine love encompasses all dimensions of another person's being, including vulnerability and limitation. Her life's work in establishing institutions dedicated to women's education articulates the conviction that women possess intellectual capacities equal to men and deserve opportunity for their complete development. The narrative further communicates that authenticity, though frequently complicated by social resistance and personal fear, generates consequences that persist across generations, and that authentic engagement with one's own capacities and with the genuine needs of others constitutes the proper investment of one's finite existence. Dear listeners, we invite you to reflect upon the principles that Eleanor and the Duke embodied through their lived experience. We encourage you to undertake the difficult work of authentic engagement within your own lives. Genuine connection with those whom you encounter, commitment to your own authentic development, and deliberate attention to creating structures and institutions that permit others to exercise their complete humanity. Please subscribe to our channel, Victorian Romance Audio Stories, to ensure you do not miss future narratives dedicated to exploring the transformative power of authentic love and authentic principle. Share your reflections regarding Eleanor and the Duke's remarkable journey in the comments section below. We are profoundly interested in understanding how this narrative resonates with your own understanding of authentic love, authentic principle, and the possibilities that emerge when human beings commit themselves to genuine engagement, despite the social complication that such commitment frequently generates. Thank you sincerely for the time you have dedicated to engaging with this narrative. We have undertaken this creative work with the perception that stories of authentic principle and authentic love constitute a vital form of cultural transmission, vehicles through which we might inspire one another toward greater authenticity in our own lives and toward more genuine engagement with those around us.